Splash. My name is Anthony McQuiggan. Many thanks for joining me this evening. It's very unusual to be talking to you tonight on a Zoom meeting, and I'm used to getting feedback from the audience, so this is a very strange experience. I hope that you'll enjoy this evening, and I'm happy to take questions at the end just to keep the flow going. Firstly, can I thank the Chelmsford City Council for the invitation to speak tonight, and to the President for his kind introduction. This evening's talk is drawn from a number of sources, including those on the screen. So let's get started. Most of us know that water covers 70% of the planet, and we're unique as a planet in that we have water in all three phases, as a solid and as a liquid, and also as a gas, which is pretty cool as far as planets go. You might even say unique. All three phases in the vicinity of one another. Most importantly, water is perfectly recycled. It never disappears. From the evaporations over the sea and the ocean, to the rain clouds, to the rain onto the hill down below, into the rivers where we make most use of it, or back into the rivers and returning to the ocean again. It's the river to river phase that we will be addressing tonight, and how this impacted Chelmsford, why water is so important to Chelmsford and its growth into the city we know today. So let's briefly look at the history of water use. We're aware that as recently as 2000 BC, the Greeks and the Indians cleaned up their water supplies by boiling it and also by using sand filters. In 1500 BC, the Egyptians were using alum as a filter, and by 500 BC, the Hippocratic sleeve sieve was in use. The Romans were moving water along by 500 BC, literally, and over large distances in aqueducts and in channels and pipes, and the massive engineering works undertaken all over the empire. These sometimes included storage systems or reservoirs to smooth the seasonal water supply. So we drift through the Dark Ages and nothing new seems to happen until, well, 1627, when Roger Bacon documents a desalination process, and by 1676 microorganisms are seen and identified in the water that we use for the first time. By 1700 we are removing these organisms with a new type of filter such as wool and sponge and charcoal. And in 1804, the first commercial water sand filter plant was constructed in Scotland by Robert Thom. Clean water at last. In 1854, however, John Snow showed that cholera was spread from water pumps in London, and we shall see later on this story. Here in Chelmsford, this work was to have a dramatic effect. So we will start our water story in Chelmsford. Some parts of Chelmsford, like Gallywood, hardly existed and had no recorded water supply at all. Well, little changes from the Middle Ages until the mid-19th century, and Chelmsford town's layout followed the Y-shaped orientation of the rivers Cann and the Chelmsford, and the geometry of the main streets, the High Street, Duke Street, Broomfield Road and Molsham Street, were pretty much as they are now. 500 years earlier, however, on the 20th of June in 1341, the Black Friars obtained a licence to acquire 3 acres of land in Chelmsford for the enlargement of their dwelling place and to make a conduit to it from a well in Chelmsford. The public water supply installed by the Black Friars ran in cleverly jointed wooden pipes from the Burgess Well, now the Civic Car Park, to Tyndall Square and the environs of the to yet be constructed cathedral. The early beginnings of the water supply here in Chelmsford were born, and 500 years later the only public drain also ran down the hill from the new conduit to the marketplace, along an open channel right down the High Street to a discharge point at the gullet on the River Chelmsford, from spring to river. So apart from the town centre, much of Chelmsford water wasn't from a single well or a pipe, but a multiple of sources from springs, and here in Gallywood, where I now live, these arose on the east side of the village. Most of the wells were not impregnated with iron and sulphur and purging salt like those at Springfield Water, north of the river, but they all provided a clean source of potable water. Until the Public Health Act, the Water Act, in 1878, there was little public water, every man for himself. But after 1878, it was the responsibility of each parish to provide water for their residents. This was achieved in most cases by means of the village pump, as was the case here in Gallywood and elsewhere in Chelmsford. So where were the people getting their water from apart from the rivers? Well, from the springs, wells, pumps and ponds. Where were the springs, wells and pumps? Well, the distribution of water is due to the underlying geology. And this is Gallywood outlined in green here. And this is the river basin in Chelmsford shown in yellow and Gallywood shown in green. And I will overlay the wells and pumps here to illustrate the distribution. Note the yellow river course and the gravels in blues and greys and the clays in browns. If we zoom into Gallywood, you can see that water drains through the surface gravels deposited in the last ice age until it hits the underlying clay, seen here on the surface of Gallywood Common. The water is therefore available just under the surface as it sits on the clay, having been filtered through the gravel. Everyone in Gallywood has a well or a pump, and the buildings and farms follow the underlying geology, giving access to water for domestic and farm consumption. Clean water was available just below the surface, and roads like Well Lane took its name from the availability of water, and others like Ponds Road from the surface pond that sat on the clay very close to the surface. Settlement was along the line of the available water, and for example, again in Gallywood, the blacksmith, the baker and the pub grew up with adjacent ponds. The pub being popular due to the large pond used by cattle on the way to market and travellers stopping to water their horses. So here's an example of a pump, again in Gallywood, and this one at Piper's Tie, taken in 1925, of one of the Wyborough family. Gallywood did not get running water until 1959, in my lifetime, but that is a story for later on this evening. Most pumps and wells were private, but public ones began to appear, like this one, after the Water Act in 1878, when parishes had to provide clean water for their residents. Early pumps were often made from wood, but later cast iron was used, and two notable foundries in Chelmsford produced many types of pumps which were installed locally. The name Coleman and Morton came from the London Road ironworks in Chelmsford and can be found on a pump in Newport, Essex, dated 1877. The company was originally named Coleman and Son. It was established in the 1850s. They manufactured and sold a very vast range of agricultural implements, including wagons, cultivators and water carts. The partnership was wound up in 1906, but the name lives on. The name Richmond and Son Engineers, also in Chelmsford, is reported on a large roadside pump in Southminster in Essex. English Heritage report it is of importance as the only known identifiable casting of the Richmond foundry and the only two obelisks to survive. The other circa 1850 is at Ridgewell. So Chelmsford had a thriving industry manufacturing pumps for the supply of clean water to the town and its locality. And if anybody knows of any pumps or infrastructure locally, I'm always happy to receive photographs. Wells, pumps, pipe, indeed anything that's built about water. Please send them to me and I'll put my email up at the end of this talk. We'll continue our story in Chelmsford and pick up in 1669 and the conduit that the good friars had laid in the 1400s. This is from the Easter Session Rolls in 1669 and it's held in the Essex Records Office in Chelmsford, and they tell of the elm pipes and the watercourse from a spring called Sturge's Well near the town. We know this as Burge's Well now, piping the water to a conduit house, an aqualogium, placed in the town. The water supply had been constructed at the friars' own expense, and it tells that the inhabitants have allowed the common sewer to become obstructed, not by having repaired the supply pipes, that they ought to repair them at the same time. This was a rocket and more than a slapped wrist. It was a call to action to fix the problem, and this was an early example of what had become public infrastructure in Chelmsford, and the people being told to go out and fix the problem. So the supply was fixed and the water was flowing again. Less than 4 years later, in 1683, the town notables, including Anthony Knightsbridge of Writtle and the rector of the church, signed a lease with the landowner so that they were able to have free liberty of ingress and regress upon such parts of land called vintners as already dug and hereafter shall be dug for the conveyance of water in trunks, pipes, brickworks from Burge's Well to the conduit head in the public street of Chelmsford. They formalised the supply route with the landowner and secured the right for 99 years to be able to maintain the supply legally. I can see that some of you have spotted the problem already, and we'll come back to this lease 99 years later. So in 1683, in Chelmsford town, the first water sources were the ancient Admiral Park Springs, Burge's Well Spring, and the Mildmay Artesian Well. The new brick channels and wooden elm pipes had been relayed from the Burge's Well Spring in 1683 to feed the High Street by gravity. It's a drop of some 2.1 metres along its length. The public water supply had originally been installed by the Blackfriars in June 1341, 300 years earlier, and now ran in cleverly jointed wooden pipes made of elm from the Burge's Well, the civic car park now, to the conduit square, now Tyndall Square. And even in early times, they were of a sophisticated construction, made by boring a trunk, typically an elm, and then bound with rope, later with copper or steel bands to hold them tight and waterproof with grout. These photographs are not the actual pipes, but they would have been similar to these examples. And I understand that the photo in the upper right is from Southend. The other photos are from a museum exhibit, but show the construction rather well. So the water flowed from the spring to what is now Tyndall Square by a modern pipe, with excess waste that flowed down the centre of the town in an open gully. Note that the Black Boy Inn on the corner to the right in this 1762 engraving is where the baths were, and an adjacent public bath was also in the High Street. There was no Shire Hall yet at the head of the street. (1683) and they fixed the supply, and by 1771 things were getting a little dodgy, so they needed some upkeep. The public were taking 54 gallons a day from the supply. Now we take some 20 million gallons a day. the Mildmays stepped in to help, and Sir William Mildmay, who owned most of the land south of the river, put up some money into the pot together with the church wardens, the successor of the friars, to pay for the upkeep of the water supply. The money was invested and an annual sum drawn to spend on the upkeep. They also got money from businesses as well as the public, and to account for this money, publicly deposited it in a conduit box. It was cared for by the constables. Remember the 99 lease? So here it comes, on its way back to bite them. Sir William Mildmay's charity, the Burgess Well charity, steps in. There's a legal case, and opinions as to the inhabitants' right to the watercourse from Burgess Well to the conduit is the subject of the case. Whoops, the 99 lease was up, and the new owner of the land through which the friars had buried the pipes was threatening to cut the same. Again, thanks to the Essex Record Office, we can find out what went on, and the matter was resolved. Money, no doubt, changed hands. But all was not well, because in 1789, 7 years later, a petition was put together signed by 15 inhabitants of New Street, of Livers Lane in Chelmsford, and it was presented for new arrangements to convey water to these streets from the conduit, the old supply having been cut off by the building of Shire Hall in 1789. Oh, new! The new development would affect the nearby underground infrastructure. Within the year, a new conduit head and the Shire Hall was rebuilt. It was completed in 1792, 2 or 3 years later, and water was made to spout from dolphins' mouths at the feet of this elegant naiad, or water nymph. The developer of Shire Hall had paid for this, and indeed the naiad was designed by the Shire Hall architect. The splendid naiad was banished, however, later from its pedestal 22 years later in 1814, and the naiad was lost from sight for many, many years. With the coming of Shire Hall and the growth of the High Street, the water supply was extended, though the primary distribution was still by pail, carried from the naiad by water carriers to its destination, probably for a few pence. A water carrier can be seen here in this painting in 1795 by Philip Rennegrain. You can see the naiad here in what is now called Tyndall Square, and now the location of the statue of Lord Tyndall, a great hero of Chelmsford, and its opposite Shire Hall. You can see the water carrier with his yoke and 2 pails about to take the water to the adjacent buildings on the High Street. And I love this painting. It tells us so much of life in 1795. We heard how the conduit itself was built in 1792, when the water was made to spout from dolphins' mouths at the feet of this elegant naiad. Well, banished from its pedestal in 1814, the naiad was lost out of sight for years and years. But it was discovered in 1914 and was moved to a secret garden, where it was moved from its secret garden in Springfield, and it's now in a safe place inside Shire Hall. The conduit structure minus the naiad was moved in 1852 lower down the High Street at the junction with Springfield Road. The conduit head seen in this later photo is described by White's Directory of Essex in 1848 as a handsome structure crowned by a dome with a gas lamp and re-erected on the site of the old one in 1814 at the cost of £100. The money was left by Robert Greenwood Esquire, and the additional sum contributed by the inhabitants was also put towards it. It's not known at what time the original contract was re-erected, but it was improved by the noble family of the Fitzwalters and has since been frequently repaired and altered. So improvements by Robert Greenwood, and in 1852 rebuilt again by the parish, obviously as a result of the earlier Water Act, and you can see the Black Boy Inn now replaced by Barnard's Hotel. Obviously, health and safety clearly not what it is today, and another example of life in Chelmsford for the chimney sweep on his unguarded ladder actually standing on the pavement on the side of the street. Shire Hall at the top of the High Street can just be seen. Here's a colorised photo from about the same time showing the conduit head in all its glory minus the naiad, but this time showing the pub on the left, crowned and owned by the famous Great Baddow Brewery in what is now Great Baddow and Gallywood. Clean water being available here for the making of good beer, shipped to Chelmsford. So much for clean water. We now come to the health issues. Even from the 1700s, clean water was consumed directly from the source, and there was no treatment of waste or sewerage, and largely this was put back or allowed to flow back into the ground, into a ditch or a drain, without regard to any issues that this might cause. In places like Gallywood and elsewhere in Chelmsford, this was not a problem, since it took some time for the waste to propagate through the filtered gravel before it might reach the supply or extraction point. By 1831, Isabella Hazard's death was amongst the first recorded as being caused by bad or a contaminated water supply. By the 1850s, cholera was an issue in London and here in Chelmsford, and by 1852, James Fenton from the Board of Health produced the first plans in Chelmsford for a public water supply and a sewage treatment plant at King's Head Meadow in Chelmsford. The buildings are coloured pink or grey, presumably, as this is true on later 1 to 25,000 plans to indicate their construction as either of brick or stone or of wood and iron. This wonderful plan, also from the Essex Record Office, shows the supply pipes from Burgess Well into what is now Tyndall Square, and then down either side of the High Street and north onto New Street, which was becoming a development area now the railways had arrived in Chelmsford. The waste pipes and sewers were also shown in red and cleaned up the open drains on the High Street itself. On Market Day, these open drains carried the blood from the butchers' stalls to the river, and merchants were fined for not cleaning their pitch at the end of the market day, no doubt fed by water from the man with his pails. Breweries in the High Street were now possible with this new clean water supply. It was no longer necessary to bring supplies of beer from Gallywood and Great Baddow, where there was always clean water. In August 1854, a cholera outbreak occurred in Soho in London, and for the first time this was the subject of a careful investigation by John Snow, including plotting distribution of deaths on a detailed street map. He determined that an unusually high number of deaths were taking place near to a water pump in Broad Street in London, which you can see illuminated by the gas lamp in this engraving. The source of the cholera was finally hinted at. The supply from this one pump was probably contaminated and not the other pumps in nearby streets. The Broad Street pump map in 1854 showed John Snow's death map and the location of the pump at the centre of the infection. Snow's findings led him to petition the local authorities to remove the pump handle and stop the supply of water from this pump. Snow's classic study offers one of the most convincing arguments of the value of understanding and resolving a social problem through the use of scientific spatial analysis, and it's used at university courses even today. Alas, John Snow, who was born in 1813, died a hero a few years later in 1858. The 1866 political cartoon by George John Pinwell plays on the epidemiologist John Snow's work linking London and the cholera outbreaks to contaminated water. An initial examination of the well had failed to show any problems, casting doubt on John Snow's conclusions, and the pump was reopened without a further incident. However, some months later, an associate of Snow stumbled upon the records of an infant who had died of diarrhoea at the very beginning of the outbreak. The timing of her death indicated that she had been the first cholera case, and upon questioning, the mother said that she'd emptied a pail of the infant's diarrhoea into a cesspool in front of her house immediately adjacent to the water pump. The cesspool and the pump and the well were then evacuated, revealing the cesspool, which was within 3 feet of the well, was leaking, and the wall of the well was decayed, allowing the contamination from the cesspool to seep in. In retrospect, it appeared that once the child had died, there was no further contamination of the well, and the epidemic had ended for that reason. Just a boy in 1854, and at the time of the Broad Street outbreak, John Cloth Thresh became the county medical officer based here in Chelmsford. John Cloth Thresh was born in Wakefield in Yorkshire in 1850, and he was educated privately at Owens College in Manchester, and his early interests were centred on pharmacy and on chemistry. And he graduated with a Doctor of Science from the University of London in 1884, and he was thus very well aware of the public health problems. He became in Chelmsford one of the pioneering fathers promoting the importance of environmental hygiene. A street in Longford near the modern waterworks is named after him, John Thresh Way in Malden, and he lived in New London Road in Chelmsford, and this will be the location of a new blue pack which got my support. He is best known as the author of The Examination of Water and Water Supplies, which is regarded as the universal standard work on water. It went to many editions and reprints right through the 1960s, and it became a standard text for every water engineer all over the world. I'm fortunate to have a first, second and third edition copy in my library. He was responsible for the water infrastructure improvements in Chelmsford in the 1900s, including, as we shall hear, at Sandford Mill and at Longford. His book became the benchmark for public health improvement, and it is a comprehensive and weighty tome. John Cloth Thresh is another great hero of Chelmsford. So moving on to the 1900 and Chelmsford's sources of water supply then. 2 notable extraction points at Admiral's Park and the original at Burgess Well, and the Fairfield Road Spring, which now had a small reservoir. The water tower and reservoir at Admiral's Park was a splendid thing to behold. The Admiral's Park water was pumped up into the reservoir, into the tower here in this 1905 photograph. A water borehole had been drilled earlier to allow high volumes to be extracted, and the elevated tank could supply water further distances by gravity as the town grew. At the historic Burgess Well, water rising in the kitchen garden of 15 Fairfield Road was enclosed in a new covered reservoir of 34,000 gallons before flowing through an iron pipe under Burgess Well Road onto a tank at Harrington's Market Garden, where it was joined by water from 2 other springs. These fed watercress beds before being filtered using sand, gravel and charcoal before entering the tank via earthenware pipes. Nice clean water. The water was then transferred by iron pipes again to the Mildmay Yard reservoir, where it mixed with water from the artesian well there in Hall Street. Water from this source was hard, and from 1853 water from the deep boreholes was soft, and as a consequence these were used alternatively, and notices informed the public on which days they were to receive hard or soft water. The Burgess Well Spring and Reservoir pumped water also to Wood Street. Subject of an outbreak of diarrhoea, horse manure was spread on an adjacent garden and washed into the open tank there. Water was later pumped into the Wood Street Reservoir, which was established there, making a natural higher elevation storage point, and this then supplied water to the town below. Later this reservoir would be supplied from the 1930 Sandford Mill treatment works. It's no longer there at the Highlands Parade at the junction of Wood Street and Gallywood Road or Stock Road. Water from the covered reservoir at Wood Street was also piped to the Mildmay Yard reservoir in Hall Street, which was a brick construction underground with a galvanised iron roof at ground level. It held 545,000 litres, about 120,000 gallons of water, and the Mildmay artesian well was sunk in 1853 to a depth of 173 metres into the chalk. Initially, water overflowed, but when a second well was dug in 1901 of 201 metres depth, the water level settled 27 metres below ground level and could easily be pumped up into the reservoir. The photo shows the site of the Mildmay Yard reservoir. There, wells are adjacent to the Chelmsford Silkworks building, which in turn became the home of the original Marconi Company, the first radio factory in the world, and later it went full circle and became the offices of the Essex Water Company when Marconi's moved out to the modern New Street works. The office of John Thresh, of whom we heard earlier, was based in this building. By 1901, Great Baddow was a wealthy, compact suburb in Chelmsford. Water was adequately supplied from springs there that rose into a stream feeding watercress beds just off Baddow Road. This was just opposite the Beehive Lane junction, and the spring flowed down into the river Chelmsford across the mead. In 1901, a borehole was drilled here to a depth of 122 metres, and it was sunk to augment the supplies with demand from an increased population, particularly towards Springfield. It fed properties on both sides of the river through an underground river pipe. A tower was also built here, similar to the one in Admiral's Park, and this is the only photograph I can find of it, and it shows David Williams, who happens to be a member of the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Managers, and it's borrowed from his most excellent water website. The redundant tower was demolished in 1960s, however, after the reservoir at Gallywood was opened, of which more is to come. A little interesting report by Miller Christ and May Thresh in 1910. Note the Thresh name here. It's about the spring in Mr. Pugh's field near the river Chelmsford. It bubbles and whitish sand emerges, not a bad sign of a perpetual spring. Dr. Mellish advised the patient, Mrs. Hollingworth, to drink the waters of this spring, and by all accounts she was soon completely cured, even if it was known to be a mild putative. By 1912, both the Burgess Well and the Admiral's Park were supplying about 260 or 400 cubic metres. Supplying 260 and 400 cubic metres separately to the town. And by 1912, public toilets were added underneath the tower in Admiral's Park. The river was canalised in 1797 and the Chelmsford and Blackwater Canal was established. This allowed goods to be transported from the Blackwater estuary to Chelmsford, especially timber and coal by horse-drawn barges. This increased the volume of the river and lock gates, making the canal section of a similar depth along its entire length from Chelmsford to the Heybridge Basin. The canal acted at this stage more like a reservoir and also had the positive effect of allowing chemical and biological quality improvements as it wound its path. This led to a reduction in the nitrates and in calcium concentrations in the water. There was also a negative effect of algal blooms, particularly in the summer, with lower flows and warmer water. So, water extracted from the river? Up to this point, springs, deep wells and boreholes supply a pure and wholesome water that only requires terminal chlorination as a precaution. That was a John's Thresh initiative. The capacity had been reached, however, and Chelmsford was still growing, particularly after the wartime investment in factories such as Compton's, Hoffman's and Marconi's. Water from the river directly was the obvious solution. However, the quality of the river varies enormously. It's easy to bacteriologically and chemically pollute this water, as we've seen, and also it's prone to flooding, to sewage effluents and to Chelmsford industrial and chemical environmental pollution. There were tanneries, foundries, butchers, breweries, all along the banks of the river. So what was Chelmsford to do? Up steps the local authority, and in 1923 seeks powers from the Secretary of State. Indeed, questions were raised in the House and permission to extract water from the River Chelmer was obtained. The Chelmsford Corporation selects a site at the old mill at Sandford. Sandford Mill commenced operation in 1930, but more on that later. This site extracted 5 million gallons a day, where previous extraction from boreholes was 200 to 400 cubic metres. Treatment consisted of excess lime softening and purification, and this was also added at the Longfill extraction some years later. So Sandford Mill water extractment and treatment works were built on the old course of the river. The diagonal cut is the path of the Blackwater Canal, seen here in the overlay of the map of that time, and the modern aerial photograph showing the current waterworks. A wonderful painting now in Oakland's museum from 1905, this old timber mill had been here since medieval times and had to be demolished to make way for the new pumping station and treatment works after the corporation had obtained permission to extract the water there. The waterworks required settling tanks and a new pump house on the site of the old timber mill, which was demolished, as we shall see, to make way for this new brick and steel pumping hall. Water was extracted from behind the original mill weir and race and pumped into the reservoirs elsewhere in Chelmsford. I shall now use the life of one individual born in the early 1900s to illustrate the state of water in Chelmsford. The story is of William Arthur Weeks. Mum called him Arthur, and he is peeping through the upstairs window from his sickbed down onto his proud parents and his brother in their new car, registration Hotel Kilo 135. He went on, as he grew up, to be a pupil at Keggs. So it's 1927 and he's cramming for his leaving certificate, having failed to matriculate in the summer of 1927. He obviously found time to attend the building of the new extraction facility at Sandford Mill, and with his new camera he took some wonderful images which have been passed on to me by his family and about to be deposited in the Essex Record Office. I thank his grandson John Weeks, who's on the call this evening, for permission to publish them here. By 1927, William Arthur Weeks had failed his final year exams at Keggs and was cramming for his retakes in the December of 1927. However, he found time to visit the works at Sandford Mill in between his studies, and his family preserved these unique photos of the construction of the Chelmsford Corporation of the water extraction works. Here you can see the earth banks of the settling tanks before they were lined with concrete, and here the facing of the side walls, laying the final base of the tanks. But note the windmill on the north bank of the floodplain. Alas, no longer there. Here you can see the windmill and its relationship to the works and to the settling tanks. The old mill gates hold back the river water, and the new wall holds back water from the reservoir. Note the large machinery moved right into the floor of the tank during the construction phase. And note the dividing wall that can be still seen there today that separates the gravel, settling and filter beds. Here's the new gravel tank under construction, and by the end of August that year, the A and B walls in the primary settle tank were nearing completion. And note the large number of temporary buildings required for the construction team. By the 10th of September, huge quantities of reinforcing steel ready for the concrete pour. And up go the internal walls. Then in November, the river flooded the site and work stopped. And this photograph is remarkable and unique in what it shows. Note the flood level over the gates that the man is standing on, and of particular interest is the demolition of the old timber mill, boxed in yellow, and the house on its left side. The house on the left is all that is left of the old mill buildings, and the new pump house can be seen in the modern aerial view below. This is the only photograph that I have ever seen of the site showing the demolished mill. The final photograph in the series was in the winter of 1928, with the site frozen and the construction still continuing. William was young and keen, and he was snapped up by the Chelmsford Corporation after he passed his exams and became a borough engineer, working on many projects while he lived in Chelmsford. Having been brought up to place all women on a pedestal of high respect, time and experience had, however, taught him that there were exceptions to this golden rule, and his first disillusionment came in his very early professional life at the corporation, having been instructed to make a report on the condition of the public conveniences in Chelmsford Sound. Both the ladies' and the gents' toilets were inspected, and he found that the female lavatory bard was more bawdy than the male bard. It shook him, and it took him some time to recover from this revelation. Arthur William Weeks was later mentioned in dispatches in 1944 for building bridges, docking areas in Italy and following the Allied advance there. His troopship was torpedoed in 1942 en route to North Africa. He was later made a Fellow of the Institute of Civil Engineers, and he became a borough surveyor. He is recorded in the Great Baddow Births Register as entry 285 and in the Gallywood Marriage Register as entry number 19. So Sandford, originally a corn mill, shown in the upper left in the 1923 photograph just prior to the demolition, and in the earlier watercolour that we saw before. Here we're looking at the other side of the mill. You can see the house on the right survives today, but the remaining buildings were all demolished. The Chelmsford Waterworks now has a brick pump house replacing the old wooden mill operated on this site, and from 1929 it pumped water until it was closed in 1984. The pump house drew 20 million litres of water per day from the river, and boreholes filtered and pumped the river water to Gallywood and later to the Hanningfield reservoirs, and water was also extracted at Longford, which is further down the river. Here's a photo from the water company publication just after completion of the later treatment works on the middle left, and showing the open settling tanks top right that we saw in the William Arthur Weeks 1927 photo set. The switchgear and control panels inside the engine pump shed in a 1950 photographs are clear at the far end of the hall. The 3 pumps were made by Compton Parkinson right here in Chelmsford and installed later in 1950. These supplied the pump water from diesel tanks in the day and used off-peak electricity at night. If you ever get to Sandford Mill, the grey areas on the modern engine house mark the position of the diesel engine and the alternator bases. The recent colour picture shows the original Marconi hut, now moved from Writtle. It was the home of 2MT, and the birthplace of regular broadcast radio 100 years ago next year. The far end of the call can be seen the white circular meters detailing the levels of the remote reservoirs and the volume of water being pumped from this pump house. The large water pipes can be seen on the right of the hall and across the windows there. This is a photo of the engine house as it is today, and a view of the treatment and settling tanks with the rear and the sluice gates holding back the water supply at the head of the water for the pumps in the 1950s. So Chelmsford grew, and the demand from water was rising rapidly. And during the early 1930s, after Sandford Mill had started up, and especially in 1932, 1933 and 1934, there was a severe series of droughts which seriously affected the shallow walls, with many drying up all over Chelmsford. Parts of the area where families were without water had to cart it over very long distances, and the extraction of water at Sandford was thus just in time. However, in the dry summers there was an occasional incident where the abstraction of water by the water company would reduce the canal level to such an extent that barges ran aground. The annual volume of water rose from 16 million gallons in 1904 to 26 million in 1930. The supply from Ingatstone rose from 6.5 to 15 million, and at Writtle from 3.5 to 8 million, and at Broomfield from 4 to 10 million. Chelmsford was growing very rapidly, and in spite of the increased extraction at Sandford, more water was needed, and so was more storage. So the drought and the high level of extraction demanded by the growing town of Chelmsford caused a rethink. A public meeting was held in Gallywood to discuss the location of a new reservoir to replace the small tank lower down the hill at the Wood Street Gallywood Road location that we heard of earlier, and now supplied from the new Sandford Mill with the new water pumps there. The proposed sites were shown in green and pink and were enclosures on the Gallywood Common. Now this is a cautionary tale, and the residents of Gallywood are pretty passionate when it comes to the Common, and which then house the racecourse and the neighbouring pioneering golf course. The Chelmsford racecourse, the original hole of the King's Cup now held in Cheltenham, was run here, and the grandstand can be seen at the bottom centre in black, now the Gallywood Heritage Centre, and it also shows the Chelmsford Golf Club, whose clubhouse in the top middle was adjacent to the Horse and Groom pub and had its pioneering 9-hole course on the common and its clubhouse adjacent to the pub. Its first president was Lord Rayleigh, and the vice president was the Member of Parliament and Prime Minister Lord Balfour, who served from 1902 to 1905. This was not the place for the corporation to store water. Gallywood made its voice heard, and the inevitable public consultation for the new reservoir was finally to be built outside of the common on farmland to be bought from Mrs. Keane, and the new site, where it now is shown in red. So we get to 1940, and now boots and no men on the roof of what was the Black Boy Inn. In April 1940, the conduit was moved to Tower Gardens on Roxwell Road, having been deemed to be an obstacle to traffic flow on the High Street. New traffic lights were installed instead, and these can be seen in the inset picture, and very smart they are too. In September 1945, the reservoir in Gallywood had not, 1949, the reservoir at Gallywood had not yet been started, partly due to the war and partly because the transfer of land couldn't be conducted until after the death of Mrs. Lavinia Keane, the great philanthropist and resident of Gallywood, who gifted the land just south of the reservoir plot where she had built the Keane Hall for the village. She also built the almshouses opposite Kegs in Chelmsford, some places of which were in the gift of Gallywood Parish Council until recently. She also built a lot of properties in the East End of London, including one which was to become central in the fight against AIDS in the 1980s. She was a great Gallywood lady. So the reservoir at Gallywood was underway, and in 1959 the Great Chelmsford flood arrived. Note that in 1951 the new filter and treatment house had not been built yet at Sandford Mill at the bottom of the picture. But the flood encompassed the pump engines and the pump house, causing some damage. And many thanks to the Heritage England site for saving the RAF photograph of this extensive damage to Chelmsford. The distant railway line is seen poking above the water on its elevated embankment and can be seen here in the distance in this photograph. The construction of the new reservoir at Gallywood was well underway by now, and the roof support pillars just visible can be seen. The new Keane Hall, completed just before the start of the Second War, is visible to the left, and the Eagle crossroads at Gallywood is visible in the centre at the crossroads of Watchhouse Road diagonally to left-right, and the Stock Road left to right in parallel with the racecourse. St Michael and All Angels Church, in its prominent position at the top of the hill was built by Mr Pryor of Highland House for his wife, and rumour has it that he only visited the church once, having disagreed with the fire and brimstone preaching of the new vicar there. I like the fact that there's a double-decker bus just outside the school, and the new post-war houses on Watchhouse Road for returning servicemen from the war have just been finished and look brand spanking new. The common is also bereft of trees, not like it is now, and was a very open even in the mid-50s when this photograph was taken, and you can just see my house to the top left at the top of the picture. Another internal view, the reservoir was built in two separate halves, the earth piled high in slopes to support a concrete retaining wall all around, and the roofs of the post-war servicemen's houses on Watchhouse Road can be seen just over the retaining wall. This view shows the first half of the construction and those support pillars, and the nearly completed Reservoir A waiting for its roof, and the start of Reservoir B to the right on Common and Margaretting Road in the background. 1949 saw the opening of the Gallywood Reservoir, and the first running water and sewerage pipes were run to houses for the first time ever. The roads were dug up by Irish navvies and the hand pumps and wells were retired. The reservoir brought a better water supply for Chelmsford as a whole, but brought Gallywood from a medieval water supply into modern times, ready for the rapid housing expansion here in the 1960s. New piped water infrastructure as late as 1959, after I was born, enabling this new growth. Astounding. The mid-50s also saw the building of a new filter house for the treatment of water at Sandford Mill. Notice the wonderful gardens and how little it has changed since it opened. In the inset colour photo, you can see it in modern times. The treatment works allowed the addition of chemicals to the water in the 1950s and also allowed the increased extraction of water and the treatment of that water to be pumped up to the new reservoir at Gallywood for improved water distribution to all of Chelmsford. In this view, courtesy of the urban exploration team, is of the now closed treatment works at Sandford Mill. The chemical works have been locked away for many years since Sandford Mill was closed in 1970, but the works make an interesting photographic setting and are a marvellous reminder of times gone by. This was a municipal building, proud of its role in its time. Here are some other views of the internal instrumentation within the building, and some of the tanks from the upper floor and the instrument panels. Inside the present-day engine and pump house, now part of the Chelmsford Museum storage area, are reminders of a past age. These are still there on the end wall. Water pumped to Wood Street and Gallywood is still recorded on the meters, and the last recorded level of the reservoir in Gallywood is also there. It shows the 505,072,000 gallons, or 2.3 million cubic metres, 2,300 million litres. That's about 252,000 litres a day, every day, from 1959 to 1984. 25 years of service. 20 million gallons a year, 91 million litres a year, or 1 gallon per person per day for the 100,000 population of the people in the Chelmsford area. Today, the 7-metre depth gauge for the Gallywood Reservoir is still on the wall next to the volume flow gauges. Alas, it's been disconnected and shows 0. In summary, Sandford Mill, a long and proud story worth preserving for future generations to learn. In 1974, the Essex Water Company map showing Gallywood feeding Chelmsford from the regional pumped pipelines and the new Hanningfield Reservoir. Water is now extracted principally from the Langford Works. The circular Chelmsford strategic supply line and the connection to the Thames Valley and Suffolk supplies is also shown. And Gallywood is now supplied from Longford and Hanningfield, and the pipes that once fed uphill from Chelmsford and Sandford Mill now are fed downhill from Gallywood to the new city. As seen on the last map, the new reservoir is fed from Langford and was commissioned, and the water pumped up to here for Gallywood for downhill distribution to Chelmsford. The new work was extended in later years as new water companies took over, and by 1984 All of the extracted treatment is now from Langford. Sandford Mill is now closed. The 1984 Essex Trunk Water Network is now run by the Essex Water Company. And the story is not quite finished, because the new Chelmsford local plan, recently adopted by the Chelmsford City Council, incorporates the end of the water cycle and completes the water cycle with 3 water recycling centres returning clean water to the environment, to the rivers and to further extraction or to the sea. I'd like to thank the sponsors of the Chelmsford Science and Engineering Society for tonight's talk. Thank you all very much for your patience this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I thank the many sources of information that have enabled this talk. Without the patient archiving and the public access to our history and inheritance, this type of talk would not be possible. It is so important that we're able to pass this on to future generations. If you would like to contact me by email, it's on the screen, or I can be contacted through the Chelmsford City Council, whose organisation of this week's events has been wonderful, or I can be contacted through the Chelmsford Science and Engineering website, where I'm the treasurer. Thank you again, and I would be happy to take questions from anybody who wants to stay on the call. Thank you.